A wedding photograph sat in a dusty attic for 31 years. Nobody looked at it twice. But hidden inside that photograph, buried in a strip of film that no human eye had ever developed, was a face of a killer standing in the shadows, watching a bride and groom load wedding gifts into their car. He was close enough to touch them, close enough to hear them laughing. And nobody knew he was there. Not the 200 guests, not the photographer, not even the 2 people who would be dead within a month. This is a story of a vanishing that should have been impossible to solve, a mystery that fooled an entire police department for 3 decades, and a secret that finally clawed its way out of the dark because one grieving man refused to throw away an old envelope of negatives. Stay with me, because what happened in those Oregon woods in the autumn of 1988 is stranger, crueler, and far more calculated than anyone in that town could have imagined. Oak Creek was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. It was a small, quiet suburb tucked into the folds of Oregon's forested hills, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, with a diner on Main Street still hand-wrote its specials on chalkboard, and where the biggest scandal in a given year was usually somebody's dog getting loose during the 4th of July parade. It was safe. It was ordinary. And in the autumn of 1988, it was home to 2 young people who seemed to have been custom-built for happiness. Mark Evans was 26 years old, an accountant at a regional shipping company. And if you asked anyone in Oak Creek to describe him, they would all use the same words. Steady, reliable, quiet. He was the kind of man who checked his door locks twice before bed, who kept his car so clean you could eat off the dashboard, and who never, not once, forgot a birthday, an anniversary, or a promise. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. But he was the kind of man people trusted instinctively, the kind of man you wanted standing beside you when things got hard. Sarah, his fiancée, was 24, and she was every bit as opposite in the best possible way. She taught 2nd grade at the local elementary school, and her classroom was legendary among the town's children, decorated with construction paper leaves in the fall and paper snowflakes in the winter, always smelling faintly of crayons and cinnamon. She had a laugh that filled a room, and a habit of bringing home every stray cat and shivering dog she found wandering the streets of Oak Creek. Where Mark was quiet structure, Sarah was warmth and light, and somehow, impossibly, the 2 of them fit together like they'd been carved from the same piece of wood. They had been high school sweethearts. The couple everyone in town had watched grow up together, and when they finally announced their engagement, nobody in Oak Creek was surprised. It felt inevitable. It felt right. Mark grounded Sarah, gave her a sense of calm and permanence. And Sarah cracked Mark wide open, filled the careful architecture of his life with color and spontaneity he never would have found on his own. Together, they made sense in a way that made other couples in town a little jealous, and a little hopeful, too, proof that a love like that could actually exist outside of movies. Their wedding took place in early September of 1988 at a small community church on the edge of town, surrounded by trees just beginning to turn gold with the first breath of autumn. Nearly 200 friends and family crowded into the pews and spilled out onto the lawn afterward, and everyone who was there still remembers it, decades later, as one of those rare days that felt genuinely perfect. Mark stood at the altar in a dark suit that fit him like it had been tailored by fate itself, and when Sarah came down the aisle in a flowing white dress, her smile radiating something close to pure light, more than one guest wiped away a tear before the ceremony had even started. They didn't have money for some extravagant honeymoon overseas. Instead, they'd packed up Mark's green Ford station wagon and spent a week winding down the scenic curves of California coastline, stopping wherever they felt like stopping, eating wherever smelled good, watching the sun sink into the Pacific from a dozen different beaches. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. When they came home to Oak Creek, they moved into a small rented starter home with a white picket fence out front, the kind of house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a Norman Rockwell painting. And then life simply continued, the way life does after a wedding, quiet and unremarkable and beautiful in its ordinariness. Mark went back to his ledgers and his spreadsheets at the shipping company. Sarah went back to her classroom, pinning up more paper leaves for her students as the season deepened. They drank coffee together on the porch in the mornings before work. They waved to their neighbors. They hosted Sunday dinners for their parents, the smell of pot roast drifting out through the screen door into the cool autumn air. If you'd asked anyone in Oak Creek to name the two people least likely to ever be at the center of a nightmare, most of them would have said Mark and Sarah Evans without a second of hesitation. But exactly 4 weeks after their wedding day, that peaceful, unremarkable life shattered in a single weekend, and would take 31 years, one dying mother's attic, and a single overlooked strip of old camera film to explain why. It was Friday, October 14th, 1988. Mark and Sarah had planned a short getaway to celebrate their 1-month anniversary. Nothing extravagant, just a rustic cabin they'd rented near the foothills of Mount Hood, about a 2-hour drive from Oak Creek. The plan was simple and sweet. They wanted to hike a little, fish a little, sit by a fire in the evenings, and completely unplug from the noise of the world for 2 days. Mark told his younger brother, David, they'd be back Sunday evening, right around sunset, just like clockwork, because Mark was always like clockwork. That Friday afternoon, a neighbor watched Mark carry a cooler and a canvas duffel bag out to the green Ford station wagon parked in the driveway. Moments later, Sarah stepped out, locking the front door behind her, laughing at something Mark had said, before sliding into the passenger seat beside him. The car pulled out of the driveway, turned the corner at the end of the street, and disappeared from view. That was the last time anyone in Oak Creek would ever see them alive. Sunday evening rolled in on schedule, the sky over the town darkening early, a thin, freezing rain beginning to fall. A neighbor down the street from Mark and Sarah's house happened to glance over and notice something small but strange. The driveway was empty and the porch light, which Mark always left burning when they traveled, was completely dark. It was a small detail, almost nothing, the kind of thing you'd forget by morning. Except morning brought something much worse. Monday, at exactly 8 o'clock, the principal at Sarah's elementary school noticed her chair was empty and her name wasn't on the sign-in sheet. This wasn't just unusual. It was completely unlike her. Sarah was famous for arriving half an hour early, just to prep her chalkboard for the day. The principal picked up the phone and called the house. It rang and rang, echoing uselessly through an empty living room on the other end of the line. Across town, Mark's manager at the shipping company was staring at his own kind of confusion. Mark never missed a shift without calling days in advance. It simply wasn't in his nature. By 10 that morning, worried and unsure who else to contact, Mark's manager called Sarah's parents' house, and it was Sarah's mother, Evelyn, who picked up the phone. The moment she heard why he was calling, something cold and sharp settled instantly into Evelyn's stomach. She knew her daughter. She knew her son-in-law. Whatever had happened, it wasn't because they'd simply decided to skip work and school. That wasn't who they were. Evelyn grabbed her spare key and drove straight to their house. She let herself into the front door and was met with a silence that felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. The air inside was stale, undisturbed. Friday morning's breakfast dishes still sat neatly dry in the rack beside the sink. Mail had piled up in the slot by the door. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. It looked, Evelyn would later say, as though time had simply stopped the second Mark and Sarah walked out that door, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to come back and finish an ordinary Friday morning that had never actually ended. By that afternoon, Evelyn called the police. Normally, a missing persons report requires a waiting period before officers take real action. People are late, people get delayed, people sometimes just need space. But given the sudden and total break in routine and the remote location the young couple had been heading toward, the local police decided not to wait. A deputy was dispatched immediately to check the rental cabin near Mount Hood. When he arrived that Monday evening, the cabin's lockbox was still sealed shut. Nobody had ever checked in. The cabin sat completely untouched, waiting for guests who had never arrived. The terror in the family deepened into something closer to panic. If Mark and Sarah had never made it to the cabin, where on earth were they? The drive from Oak Creek to Mount Hood was a straightforward route, well-paved highway for most of it, with only a short stretch of mountain road near the end. A search effort launched almost immediately along that entire route. Highway patrol officers and frantic family members drove the road for hours, scanning every ravine in case the car had slid off in the rain, stopping at every diner and gas station along the way to ask if anyone had seen a young couple in a green station wagon. Nobody had. Then, on Tuesday morning, Just as the thick mountain fog was starting to burn away under the pale autumn sun, a state forestry worker was driving his truck down an old, unpaved logging road, a dead-end path, miles from the main highway, winding deep into the densest and most unforgiving part of the forest. And there, parked at an odd angle beneath a line of towering pines, sat the green Ford station wagon. The forestry worker radioed it in immediately, and within the hour, police cruisers were tearing up the dirt road, sirens slicing through the silence of the woods. Mark's younger brother David, who had been riding along with one of the search teams, jumped out of the cruiser the second it stopped, his heart slamming against his ribs. The car looked completely out of place against the wild, untouched terrain around it, as if it had simply materialized there, dropped from the sky into the middle of nowhere. A thin layer of fallen pine needles covered the hood and windshield, suggesting the car had been sitting there for at least a day or two. But as a lead detective, a man named Thomas Harris, approached the vehicle, a deep unease settled over everyone at the scene. The car had no damage, no dents, no scratches, no broken glass. The tires were perfectly intact. There had been no accident here. It was what was inside and outside the car that made the hair rise on the back of Harris's neck. He peered through the driver's side window. The doors were locked, and there, resting right on the driver's seat, gleaming faintly in the morning light, were the car keys. On the passenger side floorboard sat Sarah's brown leather purse, standing upright, completely undisturbed. Inside it, officers would later find her wallet, her identification, her credit cards, and nearly $200 in cash, untouched. A thermos of coffee sat wedged in the cup holder, half empty, the liquid inside frozen solid. There was no blood, no broken windows, no sign whatsoever of a struggle. It looked impossibly as though Mark and Sarah had simply parked the car in the middle of nowhere, locked the doors from the inside, left their own keys behind, and calmly walked away into the wilderness. But it was the items spread across the dashboard that would haunt Detective Harris for the next 31 years. Pressed flat against the windshield was a heavily creased topographical map of the surrounding mountain range, and drawn across it in thick, frantic strokes of red ink was a jagged circle, hastily drawn, urgent, almost violent in its intensity. The circle marked a remote stretch of forest locals called Whisper Basin, an area with no trails, no scenic overlooks, nothing but dense trees, dangerous terrain, and a reputation among hunters for being a place people simply didn't go. And just outside the driver's side door, pressed deep into the muddy earth, was a single set of boot prints. Not two sets. One. And they didn't lead back toward the road. They led straight into the tree line, marching directly toward the basin circled in red. Something had pulled Mark and Sarah into those woods, or something had chased them there. And whichever it was, only one person's footprints remained to tell the story. Detective Harris immediately ordered everyone back from the vehicle, knowing exactly how easily an outdoor crime scene could be trampled and ruined. Yellow police tape went up between the pine trunks, a flimsy barrier stretched against the enormity of the surrounding wilderness. But the questions kept multiplying faster than the tape could contain them. The car was an older model with manual locks. Someone had to push those locks down from inside, then step out and shut the door, leaving the keys behind on the seat. If Mark and Sarah had simply wandered off to explore, why would they lock themselves out their own escape route? And if only one set of footprints led away from the car, where was the second person who supposedly locked the doors? Forensic teams arrived within the hour, dusting the exterior for prints, fighting against a mountain dew and freezing overnight rain that had already begun destroying whatever evidence might have survived. When they finally pried the car door open, a rush of stale, frigid air spilled out. Investigators cataloged every single item inside with obsessive care. Sarah's purse, nothing missing. Her cash, her license, her favorite shade of lipstick, her checkbook, all present and accounted for. In the back seat sat the canvas duffel bag, still packed with thick sweaters and wool socks for the mountain cold. The cooler held sandwiches, sodas, and apples completely untouched. It became devastatingly clear in that moment that Mark and Sarah had never made it anywhere near their rental cabin. Their entire trip, their whole future, had ended right here, on this desolate stretch of dirt road, miles from where they were supposed to be. By mid-afternoon, the sheriff's department brought an AK-9 unit, 2 trained tracking dogs were given pieces of clothing from the duffel bag to catch the couple's scent, and they pulled hard against their leashes almost immediately, noses pressed to the wet, pine-covered earth, following the single set of deep boot prints leading away from the car. The search team pushed through walls of thorn bushes, clambered over rotting fallen logs, fought their way across a terrain that was never meant for casual hiking. Uneven ground riddled with hidden holes and steep drops that could break an ankle in an instant. The boot prints themselves told their own story. They were spaced unusually far apart, the kind of stride pattern that suggested whoever made them had been moving fast, running, either toward something waiting for them in the basin or away from something chasing them from a road. For nearly 2 miles, the dogs tracked that sent deeper and deeper into the dark canopy of the forest. And then the wilderness turned against them completely. The tracks led straight to the edge of a wide, fast-moving river, swollen with mountain runoff, water rushing violently over slick gray stones. The boot prints simply stopped at the muddy bank. The dogs paced back and forth along the water's edge, whining in frustration, noses working furiously and finding nothing. The scent was gone. Whoever had made those tracks had either waded into that freezing river or been carried away by it. What followed over the next 2 weeks was the largest search effort in the county's history. The red circle scrawled across that topographical map became the absolute epicenter of the investigation. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew low over the treetops, hunting for any hint of body heat in the freezing woods below. Hundreds of volunteers from Oak Creek and every neighboring town formed human chains through the underbrush, calling Mark and Sarah's names until their voices went raw and hoarse. But Whisper Basin gave up nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped belongings, no sign of a camp, a struggle, anything at all. It was as if the earth itself had simply opened up and swallowed 2 people whole, leaving nothing behind but silence and old rock formations and darkness. Back in Oak Creek, the emotional weight of the disappearance was becoming unbearable for everyone who loved them. Sarah's mother, Evelyn, stopped sleeping entirely. She spent her days sitting alone in her daughter's living room, surrounded by unopened wedding gifts still stacked in the corner where they'd been left. Sometimes she would simply hold one of Sarah's coats to her face, breathing in the last traces of her daughter's floral perfume, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Every single night, without fail, she left the porch light burning, just in case, against all logic and evidence. Sarah and Mark somehow found their way home in the dark. Mark's younger brother, David, channeled his grief in a very different direction. It curdled into something closer to obsession. He took an unpaid leave from work. Every morning at dawn, he drove up the mountain highway alone, hiking the trails with a flashlight, a topographical map of his own, and a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, refusing to accept that his steady, capable older brother could simply cease to exist. He stayed out there until sundown most days, screaming Mark's name into empty canyons until his throat bled raw. Eventually, the police had to ask him to stop, warning him he was contaminating potential evidence. But David couldn't make himself quit. In his mind, stopping the search meant admitting they were already dead, and he wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As the physical search of the mountains slowed under the weight of the first heavy snowfall, Detective Harris shifted his focus toward the couple's personal lives. Because in most missing persons cases, the truth is buried somewhere in the mundane details. Bank statements, phone records, secrets kept just beneath the surface. Investigators pulled 5 years of financial history and found nothing but responsible savings, a modest mortgage, and unremarkable grocery bills. No secret debts, no gambling, no mysterious cash withdrawals appearing out of nowhere. They dug into Mark's job at the shipping company, wondering if he'd stumbled onto something illegal, cookbooks, embezzlement, anything that might explain a sudden violent silence. Corporate auditors combed through every ledger he'd ever touched. Every single penny was accounted for. Mark was exactly who he appeared to be, an honest, hard-working accountant who kept his head down and did his job well. They interviewed Sarah's friends, her fellow teachers, old college roommates, asking the uncomfortable questions investigators always have to ask. Was there a jealous ex-boyfriend somewhere in her past? A stalker nobody had taken seriously? But every lead dissolved into nothing. Sarah had dated no one but Mark since she was 17 years old. She was, by every account, universally adored. And that, in the end, was what made the case so maddening. Crimes of motives. People vanished because of money, revenge, jealousy, desperation. But Mark and Sarah had just promised their entire futures to each other. They were financially stable, deeply in love, and almost aggressively ordinary. There was no reason, none, for them to drive down a forgotten logging road, lock themselves out of their own car, and disappear into freezing wilderness. And yet they had. Winter buried Oak Creek in snow that year, and with it, the dirt road where the green station wagon had been found. The organized search parties disbanded. The evening news stopped running Mark and Sarah's photographs. The missing posters taped to the diner windows slowly curled and yellowed under the weak winter sun. Officially, unofficially, in every way that mattered, the case was going cold. Detective Harris hated that phrase. To him, cold case always felt like a quiet admission of defeat. Even as new robberies and assaults piled up on his desk demanding his attention, he kept a thick, heavily tabbed file on Mark and Sarah Evans sitting right in the center of his workspace, staring at those crime scene photographs late into the evening, hoping that some new angle would suddenly click into place. Again and again, his eyes drifted back to that single piece of physical evidence that made no sense, the topographical map and the jagged red circle drawn around Whisper Basin. Forensics had already confirmed there were no usable fingerprints on the paper. The cold and condensation inside the car had destroyed anything that might have been there, and the ink itself was nothing special, just an ordinary red felt-tip marker sold in any hardware store. A dead end, wrapped around another dead end. Then, one evening in February, nearly 4 months after Mark and Sarah vanished, something happened that would change the entire shape of the investigation. And it happened almost by accident. Harris was alone in the precinct, the heating vents rattling overhead, his eyes burning from exhaustion after another long night of getting nowhere. The original map lay spread across his desk under the harsh glare of an adjustable reading lamp. He traced the red circle with the tip of his pen. Over and over, tried to imagine the mind of the person who had drawn it. Was it a warning? A meeting point? A moment of pure panic? Frustrated, he reached over to switch off the lamp, and his hand knocked it instead, sending the heavy metal fixture toppling onto the desk. The bulb landed at a sharp, low angle, throwing harsh, raking light directly across the surface of the map. And Harris froze. In that low, angled light, deep shadows suddenly bloomed across the paper, and in those shadows, faint indentations became visible, nearly invisible until that exact moment, overlapping the printed contour lines right beside the red circle. It looked unmistakably like someone had once pressed a separate sheet of paper on top of the map and written something on it, pressing down so hard that the words had scarred straight through into the paper underneath. Harris grabbed a magnifying glass from his desk drawer, his breath catching in his throat. The indentations were frantic, messy, urgent. It was handwriting. Someone had written a message, and that message had been sitting right there on the dashboard the entire time, invisible to every investigator who had touched that map for the past 4 months. The very next morning, Harris drove straight to the state crime laboratory, bypassing the usual queue and demanding the document examiner run the map through an electrostatic detection device, a specialized machine designed to lift hidden indentations out of paper. For 3 excruciating hours, Harris paced the hallway, drinking terrible vending machine coffee, his mind spinning through every possibility. If Mark or Sarah had written something in their final moments, who was it meant for? What could it possibly say? Finally, a technician called him back into a darkened room. The machine had coated the map in fine dark toner powder that clung only to the deeply pressed fibers of paper, and a clear plastic sheet had been laid over the result to preserve it. The technician sat on a brightly lit viewing board, his voice unusually quiet as he told Harris he didn't know exactly what they were looking at, but whoever wrote it had clearly been terrified. Harris stepped up to the board, and there, glowing under the light, was handwriting that had been silently waiting inside that map for 4 months. It wasn't a goodbye note. It wasn't a suicide note. It was something far worse, a realization, scrawled in a rushed and desperate hand. 2 sentences. That was all. We were wrong about the car following us. He is at the wedding. He is in the pictures. Detective Harris stood frozen in that darkened lab, staring at those words until they blurred in front of his eyes. In an instant, Everything he thought he understood about this case collapsed. Mark and Sarah hadn't simply wandered off into woods. They hadn't been the victims of some vague, random tragedy. They had been hunted, and worse, they had known it. They had understood, in their final moments, exactly what was happening to them. Harris pieced together the sequence almost immediately. Mark and Sarah must have picked up a fresh set of wedding photographs on Friday afternoon, right before leaving for their weekend getaway. Somewhere along that lonely mountain highway, they'd noticed a vehicle trailing behind them. At first, probably nothing more than an annoyance, a rude driver keeping too close. But at some point, while Sarah sat in the passenger seat flipping idly through the newly printed photos of their wedding day, something in one of those pictures must have caught her eye. She would have glanced up out the rear window at the car following them and recognized, with a jolt of pure horror, that the stranger trailing them up the mountain was the exact same man lurking in the background of their wedding photographs. Panic must have exploded through that car in an instant. They tried to lose him, veering off the main highway onto the remote logging road, hoping the maze of the forest would shake him loose. But the road dead-ended, and there was nowhere left to run. Trapped, with the stranger's vehicle closing in behind him in the freezing rain, Mark had grabbed a pen and pressed it into a notepad resting on top of the map, scrawling out a desperate warning for anyone who might find the car after them. Then they locked the doors, left the keys behind, and ran, straight into the black, tangled darkness of Whisper Basin. By the next morning, the Oak Creek precinct was in a state of total upheaval. Harris ordered his team to hunt down every single photograph taken on the day of the wedding. They tracked down the professional photographer and seized his leather-bound wedding album along with every negative he'd shot. They pulled the glossy prints recovered from Sarah's purse in the abandoned car. An entire wall of the precinct disappeared beneath a corkboard covered in hundreds of photographs, and detectives spent weeks interviewing every single guest on the wedding list, staring through magnifying glasses until their vision blurred, hunting for anyone who looked even slightly out of place. An angry ex, an uninvited neighbor, a caterer nobody remembered hiring. They found nothing. The professional shots were perfectly composed. Smiling aunts, laughing cousins, happy co-workers, every face accounted for and cleared. The candid prints found in Sarah's purse were just as innocent. Ordinary snapshots of the cake, the first dance, the flower girls twirling in their little dresses. No mysterious stranger, no shadowy figure lurking at the edge of any frame. Every single face in every single photograph was positively identified. The investigation collapsed under its own weight. Had Mark and Sarah imagined the threat in a moment of panic? Had the note meant something else entirely? Had they somehow picked up the wrong set of prints from the photo lab? Without a face to chase, the police had no suspect. And without a suspect, they had absolutely nowhere left to go. Time did what time always does to unsolved cases. It slowly bled the urgency out of everything. The missing posters yellowed and were quietly taken down from the diner windows. The search maps were rolled up and shoved into cardboard tubes and forgotten in a storage closet. The green Ford station wagon sat rusting in the county impound lot for 5 long years before it was eventually crushed for scrap. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The 90s gave way to a new millennium. Oak Creek grew, new neighborhoods rising at its edges, while the dense forest around Mount had stayed exactly as wild and silent as it had always been, holding its secrets beneath decades of falling snow. Detective Thomas Harris grew old. His dark hair turned entirely white, the stress of decades on the force wearing steadily on his heart. And in 2005, he was finally forced into retirement. On his last day at the precinct, packing his personal belongings into a small cardboard box, he did one final thing before he walked out that door for good. He made a photocopy of the topographical map and a hidden indented note, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his wallet, where he would carry that failure with him quietly every single day for the rest of his life. Sarah's mother, Evelyn, never truly recovered. For the next 3 decades, she lived in a kind of frozen, suspended grief. She refused to change the locks on her front door. She refused to sell the house. She lived quietly, alone, surrounded by fading photographs of a daughter who had simply never come home. Mark's brother David eventually learned to carry the weight in his own way. He married. He moved to a neighboring town. He raised 3 children and built a successful business, doing his best to construct something resembling a normal life. But the ghost of his older brother never really left him. Every time it rained hard, David would find himself staring out a window, thinking about 2 people running through freezing mud in the dark. By the time he was in his late 50s, he had built an entire life on the outside, but somewhere inside, he was still that desperate young man screaming his brother's name into empty canyons, refusing to believe the woods had truly taken him. More than 31 years passed. The disappearance of Mark and Sarah Evans faded into something closer to local legend, a ghost story people told around campfires, a tragedy that had once gripped an entire county and had slowly, inevitably, become just another unsolved mystery lost to time. And then, in the late autumn of 2019, everything changed all at once, and it started with the quietest possible event: an elderly woman closing her eyes for the final time. Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82. With no other surviving children, the exhausting task of clearing out her home fell entirely to David. It was a slow, emotionally draining process. Weeks spent sorting through decades of accumulated memory, packing dishes into boxes, donating old furniture, throwing out cans of food that had expired years earlier. Grief, it turned out, comes with an enormous amount of paperwork and packing tape. On a quiet, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon, David finally pulled down the creaky wooden stairs leading up into Evelyn's dusty attic. The air up there was stale and thick, heavy with the particular silence of a space nobody had entered in years. He spent hours hauling boxes, sweeping away thick curtains of spiderweb, working his way toward the back corner of the space. And there, tucked beneath a pile of old winter blankets, he found a large, heavy plastic storage bin. Written across the side in thick black marker were words that stopped David cold where he knelt. Sarah's Things. Oak Creek PD Evidence Release, 1991. His hands began to shake as he understood exactly what he was looking at. This was the box of personal items police had returned to the family 3 years after the disappearance, back when the case was officially reclassified as cold and the physical evidence was moved into long-term storage. Evelyn had clearly taken that box, sealed it shut with tape, and hidden it away in the attic. Because it was simply too painful for her to ever look at it again, David used a pocket knife to slice through the brittle, yellowed tape and lifted the lid. The faint, impossible scent of Sarah's floral perfume drifted upward, perfectly preserved after 31 years in that dry, dark attic. Inside, David found exactly what he remembered from the old police files: the heavy wool sweaters from the duffel bag, the topographical map, Sarah's brown leather purse. And at the very bottom of the bin, tucked beneath a folded jacket, he found a small yellow envelope from a local 1-hour photo lab. He opened it. Inside were the same glossy prints police had stared at for months back in 1988. Mark smiling in his dark suit, Sarah radiant in white, David's own younger self laughing somewhere in the background with a drink in his hand. Completely ordinary. No stranger. No shadow. Nothing. A wave of familiar, crushing disappointment rolled through him. He started to slide the photographs back into the envelope. And then he noticed something tucked into a small protective sleeve at the very back. He pulled it out. Inside were the original strips of brown plastic film negatives. David held one strip up to the single bare bulb hanging from the attic ceiling, watching the tiny inverted images glow faintly in the light. Almost absently, he began counting the frames. 36. He counted the glossy prints in his other hand. 24. A sharp, sudden jolt of understanding shot through him. Back in the 1980s, photo labs didn't automatically print every single frame on a roll of film. If a shot came out too dark, too blurry, badly exposed, the machine simply skipped it to save paper and chemicals, and the customer never even knew those frames existed. The failed shot stayed trapped on the negatives, hidden, unseen, unless somebody deliberately went looking for them. The police in 1988 had only ever examined the 24 bright, successful prints. Nobody had thought to ask what might be sitting, dark and undeveloped, in the 12 frames that didn't make the cut. There had been no reason to look. Until now, David's heart began pounding violently in his chest. What if Sarah, bored during the long drive up the mountain, had pulled those negative strips out just to look at them, holding them up against the sunlight streaming through the car window? What if she'd squinted at one of those dark, unprinted frames and recognized something in the shadows that no one else had ever seen? He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he drove 2 hours into Portland and found a specialized digital archiving lab that dealt with restoring old and damaged film. He set the 31-year-old negative strips on the counter and told the technician he needed every single frame scanned at the highest possible resolution, especially the dark ones, the ones nobody had ever printed. The technician warned him honestly that the film had been sitting in a freezing, sweltering attic for 3 decades. The emulsion might be too degraded to recover anything at all. It would take at least a week of careful cleaning, scanning, and digital restoration. That week felt endless. David could barely function at work. He paced his house late into the night, unable to stop thinking about that note pressed into the map. He is in the pictures, he felt, in those long, sleepless days, like a man standing at the very edge of a cliff, finally about to look down into the darkness that had defined his entire adult life. Then, exactly 7 days later, at 8 o'clock in the evening, David's laptop chimed with an email, a secure link to a digital gallery. He sat alone at his kitchen table, the house silent around him, rain tapping softly against the window, an eerie echo of that same freezing rain from October of 1988. He took a slow, trembling breath, clicked the link, and opened the folder. The first images were familiar ones. The bright wedding shots, now rendered in astonishing high-resolution detail. Every thread of Mark's suit and every individual autumn leaf suddenly crisp and vivid in a way 31-year-old film had never allowed before. He clicked through slowly. 5, 10, 15. All photographs the police had already combed through years earlier. Beautiful. Useless. And then he reached image 25, the point where the glossy prints had ended. The frames no human eye had truly seen in over 3 decades. It was dark, clearly shot at night with a weak flash, showing a grainy, greenish-gray view of the church parking lot. Image 26 was more the same. Sarah, it seemed, testing the camera or trying to photograph the church sign in the dark. He clicked to image 27, and David stopped breathing entirely. The photograph showed Mark standing beside the open trunk of the green station wagon, loading wrapped wedding gifts, completely unaware the camera pointed at him. But across the dark street behind him, parked beneath the heavy branches of an old oak tree, sat a dark, heavy-duty pickup truck, a shape the digital restoration had just barely managed to pull out of the shadows. And standing beside the driver's door of that truck, leaning casually against the metal, was a tall, broad silhouette of man, staring directly across the street at Mark. David's hands began shaking uncontrollably. He clicked to image 28, the final frame on the roll. Sarah had apparently stepped closer to the street for one last spontaneous shot of the night, and this time the flash had fired brightly enough to catch the stranger's features just before it could turn away. David leaned in toward the glowing screen, drew a box around the man's face, and zoomed in. The image pixelated for a moment before the software smoothed the edges back into focus. He zoomed again. The man's face filled the entire screen, and David let out a sharp, choked gasp, shoving his chair back from the table so violently it nearly toppled, both hands flying up to cover his mouth. He knew this man. He knew this face. His eyes dropped lower, to the stranger's clothing, a heavy canvas jacket, rugged and worn, and on his feet, unmistakably clear even in that grainy flashlit frame, a pair of massive, custom-laced winter hunting boots with deep, ridged rubber soles. David didn't hesitate for even a second. He slammed the laptop shut, grabbed his car keys, and ran out into the rain. He drove recklessly through the dark, pushing well past the speed limit, heading straight for the small rural town where retired Detective Thomas Harris now lived out his quiet retirement. The drive took nearly an hour, but to David, sitting hunched over the wheel with his mind screaming, it felt like it lasted only seconds. He pulled violently into Harris's driveway, tires skidding across wet gravel, and pounded his fist against the front door hard enough to shake the frame. A few minutes later, the porch light flicked on, and the door opened slowly to reveal Thomas Harris. Older now, frielier, wrapped in a thick flannel robe, squinting through wire-rimmed glasses at the soaked, frantic man standing on his porch in the middle of the night. "David," Harris said, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "What in God's name are you doing here at this hour?" David couldn't answer. He pushed past the old detective into the small living room, set his laptop down on the coffee table, and opened with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He pulled up image 28, zoomed in on the man's face and the distinctive boots, then stepped back and simply pointed at the screen. Harris walked slowly to the table, pulled a pair of reading glasses from his robe pocket, and leaned down to study the photograph. For 10 long seconds, the only sound in the room was the rain hammering against the roof. Then Harris stopped breathing. Every trace of color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden table, so tightly his knuckles turned white. He removed his glasses slowly, his eyes wide with something that looked like pure horror. "David," he whispered, in a voice David had never once heard from before. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me this is a mistake." "It's real," David choked out, tears finally breaking free and streaming down his face. It was in the negatives. The police never developed them. He was standing right there in the dark, watching them load the car. Harris stared back at the screen, at the custom-laced hunting boots, at the thick canvas jacket, at the face of the man standing beside the dark truck. And in that moment, a second, even more devastating recognition crashed over him. It was the face of the very first civilian to respond to the missing persons call back in 1988. The face of the man who had commanded volunteer search teams. The face of the man who had walked shoulder to shoulder with police for weeks, quietly directing them away from the deepest, darkest corners of the woods. "My God," Harris breathed, stumbling back from the laptop as though it had physically burned him. He wasn't just following them, David. He was hunting them, and we let him lead the search. The living room fell into a silence so total it felt suffocating, broken only by the rain lashing violently against the window glass. David stood frozen, his mind scrambling to catch up with what he'd just heard. "What do you mean he led the search?" He finally whispered. "Who is that man, Thomas? Tell me who that is." Harris reached out and touched the edge of the laptop screen, tracing the grainy, digitally restored outline of the man's face with something close to reverence or dread. "His name is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice hollow, drained of everything except regret. "A local logging contractor, a lifelong woodsman. He knew every single inch of that mountain better than anyone alive. When Mark and Sarah went missing, the county was completely overwhelmed. We didn't have enough deputies to cover that much wilderness, so we put out a call for civilian volunteers who knew the terrain." He paused, drawing in a slow, unsteady breath before continuing. "Elias Thorne was the first man to show up at the command tent. He brought his own maps. He brought floodlights. He had this quiet, commanding presence, and the other volunteers naturally fell in line behind him. We deputized him, gave him a radio, gave him the authority to direct entire search grids. The horror of what that meant slammed into David with the force of a physical blow. He remembered that search. He remembered walking through freezing mud for weeks, screaming his brother's name until his throat bled. And now, with a sickening lurch, he remembered something else. A tall, quiet man in a dark canvas jacket, handing him a cup of hot coffee from a thermos one freezing morning, telling him gently not to give up hope. "He steered us away," Harris whispered, his eyes wide with the full, chilling weight of 31-year-old deception finally coming into focus. "My God, David, he steered us entirely away from them. I remember it now. There was a morning the tracking dogs picked up a strong scent heading east, into the rocky ravines. They were pulling hard on their leashes, and Thorne stopped the whole line. He pointed at some broken branches by a riverbank and swore the tracks had washed out in the current, told us the dogs were just following an old deer trail. He convinced me to move the entire search 5 miles to the west." A blinding surge of rage tore through David, his vision narrowing to a sharp point of pure fury. The monster who had hunted his brother and his sister-in-law hadn't simply gotten away. He had stood right beside the police the entire time. He had controlled the investigation from the inside, watched David sob in the woods, all while knowing exactly, precisely where Mark and Sarah were. David spun toward the door. "Where does he live?" he demanded, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "I'm going there right now." "Stop." Harris's voice cracked like a whip, his old instincts flaring instantly back to life. He grabbed David by the shoulder with surprising strength. "You listen to me." If you walk into that man's house with a rifle, you'll go to prison, and Elias Thorne will walk away claiming self-defense. We have one piece of evidence after 31 years, one photograph. If we do this wrong, a judge throws it out, and he dies a free man. We're going to do this exactly by the book. Harris didn't wait for an argument. He picked up his home phone and dialed a number he still remembered by heart, waking Captain Robert Miller, now the head of the Oak Creek precinct, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Back in 1988, Miller had been a 22-year-old rookie standing guard over an abandoned station wagon in the freezing rain. Within the hour, he was standing in Harris's living room, and when he saw the photograph glowing on David's laptop, every ounce of color drained from his face too. There was no time to waste. As dawn began breaking gray and wet over Oak Creek, the three men drove straight to the precinct. Miller unlocked a long-term evidence storage room in the basement, the air thick with dust and rusted metal, and together they pulled the sealed plastic bins from the original 1988 investigation. They needed hard physical proof, something undeniable enough to connect that photograph to the crime scene, strong enough to convince a judge to sign off on a high-risk warrant against a 74-year-old man. Inside one small cardboard box, wrapped carefully in foam, they found it. A solid white plaster cast, the mold poured over that single set of mysterious boot prints found beside the abandoned car back in 1988. They set it beneath a bright fluorescent light beside David's laptop, zoomed in tight on the image of Elias Thorne standing in that dark parking lot. It was a flawless match. The custom-stitched leather welt, the deep ridge rubber tread designed for heavy logging work, the reinforced steel heel, every detail lined up perfectly. The boots that had stalked that wedding were the exact same boots that had left tracks marching straight into the black heart of Whisper Basin. But a match on the boots wasn't enough. They needed motive. They needed the hidden thread connecting an ordinary young accountant to an isolated logging contractor. Because whatever this was, it hadn't been random. That indented note proved Thorne had been following them, waiting patiently for his moment. Harris and Miller spent the next 12 hours combing through 6 months of Mark and Sarah's financial records, hunting for any point where their paths might have crossed with Predator. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, Miller found it, a faded carbon copy bank check dated August 12, 1988, exactly 1 month before the wedding, written from Mark's personal account, in the amount of $450, made out to Thorne Timber and Contracting. In the memo line, in Mark's own neat handwriting, front yard picket fence. The truth settled over the room like a suffocating weight. Elias Thorne hadn't spotted them randomly on some highway. Mark had hired him. The young couple had wanted a classic white picket fence for their new starter home, and Thorne had been the contractor who delivered the timber and dug the post holes, working just outside their front door for 2 entire weeks in the blistering August heat. He had watched them the whole time. Watched Mark leave for work each morning. Watched Sarah sit on the porch with her coffee, smiling at him, bringing him glasses of ice water, because that was simply who she was. Kind to everyone, including the man quietly studying every detail of their lives. He had learned their routines, listened to their conversations drifting out through open windows, heard them talking excitedly about their upcoming wedding, about their romantic weekend plan near Mount Hood. The stalking hadn't begun on some mountain highway. It had begun in their own front yard, months before they ever climbed into that car. With the financial records, the boot match, and the photograph of Thorne lurking at the wedding, Captain Miller had everything he needed. He drove straight to the county courthouse, and the judge who reviewed the file signed a sweeping search and arrest warrant without hesitation. Events moved fast after that. By 8 that evening, the Oak Creek precinct was locked down entirely. A tactical team called in from the state police, armored vehicles lining the wet streets outside as freezing rain returned in sideways sheets. David was made to stay behind in Miller's office, pacing like a caged animal, eyes locked on the radio sitting silently on the desk. He wanted to be there. He wanted to look this man in the eyes. But Harris stayed with him, a steady, calming presence, gently reminding him that real justice required patience. Even now, even after 31 years, out at the rural edge of the county, near the very border of the Mount Hood forest, the tactical convoy killed their headlights and rolled in near-total darkness down a long, winding dirt road. Elias Thorne's property stretched across 60 isolated, heavily wooded acres, ringed by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. No trespassing signs nailed every tree along the perimeter. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. A salvage yard scattered with rotting logging equipment, rusted-out trucks, and towering stacks of decaying timber. The tactical team moved with silent, practiced precision, using bolt cutters to slice through the heavy chain securing the main gate. Dozens of armed officers spread across the property, boots sinking into freezing mud, flashlight beams slicing through the rain as they scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. They converged on the main structure, a 2-story wooden house that looked like it spent decades slowly rotting back into the earth. No lights burned inside. The house sat in total silence. At the signal, a steel battering ram slammed into the front door, splintering old wood into 1,000 pieces. Officers flooded inside, weapons raised, voices sharp with command. They found Elias Thorne sitting alone in a rotting leather recliner in the pitch-black living room. The only light in the room, the faint blue flicker of a muted television. He didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even look surprised. Thorne was old now, frail in some ways, but he still carried the massive, broad-shouldered frame of a man who had spent his whole life working timber with his bare hands. As half a dozen laser sights settled squarely on his chest, he slowly turned his head toward the officers, and a slow, chilling, completely empty smile crept across his weathered face. He raised his hands calmly, wrists pressed together, ready for the cuffs, as though he'd simply been waiting patiently for 31 years for this exact night to finally arrive. He offered no resistance as they hauled him from the chair, shackled him, and shoved him into the back of a waiting cruiser. He didn't say a single word, but the arrest was only the beginning. Now came the far harder task, uncovering the truth buried somewhere on those 60 acres. Captain Miller arrived as portable stadium lights flooded the property in harsh white light, transforming the tangled woods and scrap metal into something out of a nightmare. Cadaver dogs were brought in, trained to detect the faintest trace of human remains beneath the earth, alongside ground-penetrating radar units to scan for hidden graves. The search was brutal. Freezing rain turned the ground to slick, sucking mud, and for hours the dogs found absolutely nothing, pacing nervously between the stacks of rusted timber, whining into the darkness. Then, shortly after midnight, one of the dogs broke away from its handler entirely, sprinting toward the very back edge of property, far from the main house, and stopped dead in front of a massive, overgrown mound of earth buried beneath thick blackberry brambles and rotting canvas tarps. The dog began barking frantically, clawing at the mud. Officers rushed forward with machetes and axes, hacking through the thorny vines, tearing back the heavy tarps. And there, built directly into the side of that muddy hill, sat a pair of heavy, reinforced steel doors, an underground root cellar, a concrete bunker, hidden perfectly from the entire world, sealed shut with 3 enormous padlocks that looked untouched by decades of rain. Bolt cutters snapped the locks free in sharp, echoing cracks, and Captain Miller braced his boots against the frame and hauled the heavy steel door open with a groan of protesting metal. A rush of cold, stale, ancient air poured out of the darkness below. Miller clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting down a narrow set of concrete stairs disappearing into the earth. "Police?" he shouted into the dark. Only silence answered. With 3 armed officers close behind, he descended slowly, the air growing colder with every step, the sound of the storm above fading into total, suffocating quiet. At the bottom, the concrete floor was bone dry. Miller swept his flashlight across the room, and every officer behind him froze in place, breath caught in their throats. This wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't a torture chamber. It was something far more disturbing. A perfectly preserved shrine. Against the far wall, arranged with obsessive care on a clean wooden table, sat the items that had vanished without explanation back in 1988. Mark's silver watch, its glass face polished to a shine. Sarah's wedding ring, resting on a small square of velvet fabric. And beside it, hanging from a small metal hook, a set of Ford car keys on a faded leather chain, the very keys that had locked that station wagon before the young couple vanished. But it was the object sitting at the very center of that table that made Captain Miller's blood run cold, a thick, heavily worn leather journal. He crossed the room slowly, hands trembling as he reached out and opened the cover, shining his flashlight onto the first page. And as he began to read Elias Thorne's small, obsessively neat handwriting, 31 years of unanswered questions finally, horrifyingly, began to resolve. The journal began in August of 1988, during the very week Thorne had been hired to build that picket fence. He wrote about the summer heat on his back as he dug the post holes. He wrote about Sarah, the way she smiled handing him a glass of ice water, the scent of her perfume drifting across the yard. His words revealed a deep, festering delusion in his mind. Sarah wasn't simply a kind young bride. She was an angel trapped in an ordinary life, wasted on a man he genuinely believed was unworthy of her. He convinced himself, page by page, entry by entry, that he was somehow meant to take her, to protect her from a world that didn't understand what she truly was. The obsession metastasized like a slow-growing cancer. He wrote about parking his dark truck down their street late at night, watching their lights click off one by one, memorizing their schedules down to the minute. When the wedding day finally arrived in September, he couldn't stay away. He parked across in the church in the shadows, boiling with quiet rage as he watched them load their wedding gifts into that green station wagon, never once realizing that a random, spontaneous camera flash had just captured his face in the dark. Miller turned the pages forward to the entry dated October 14th, 1988, the day they disappeared. And the true story of what happened on that mountain wasn't a story of two people getting lost. It was a calculated, cold-blooded ambush. According to the journal, Thorne had known exactly when they were leaving for their weekend trip, having listened through their open windows for weeks. He waited on the highway and followed their green station wagon into mountains, staying a few careful car lengths behind. In the passenger seat, Sarah, bored on the long drive, had pulled the envelope of fresh wedding photos from her purse, flipping idly through the bright glossy prints before pulling out the dark, unprinted negatives just to hold them up against the afternoon sunlight streaming through her window. And there, in one of those dark, rejected frames, she saw his face. She turned, looked out the rear window, and saw the exact same dark truck rolling steadily behind them on the empty mountain road. Panic detonated inside that car. Thorne wrote that he watched Mark suddenly accelerate, the station wagon swerving hard across the yellow lines as they desperately tried to gain distance. Mark understood with sickening clarity that they were completely alone out here. No phones, no police, no other cars on the road. In a final act of pure instinct, he grabbed a notepad resting on the map and pressed his pen into the paper with everything he had, scrawling that frantic, desperate warning. We were wrong about the car following us. He is at the wedding. He is in the pictures. But Mark was an accountant, not a professional driver, and Elias Thorne had spent his entire life behind the wheel of heavy machinery. 10 miles before they would have reached their rental cabin, Thorne slammed the steel bumper of his truck into the back of their station wagon, sending it spinning off the highway and crashing into a deep, muddy ditch hidden behind a thick line of trees. What the journal described next was nothing short of a nightmare. Thorne climbed down into that ditch carrying a hunting rifle. Mark and Sarah were bruised, terrified, but alive. Mark fought, threw himself completely unarmed between the rifle and his wife, fighting with everything he had to protect her. But he was simply no match for a much larger, armed man. Thorne struck him with the stock of the rifle, knocking him unconscious, then dragged a screaming, fighting Sarah out of the wreckage, bound both their hands with heavy logging rope, and threw them into the covered bed of his truck, hidden completely from view. He drove them straight back to his isolated 60-acre property and down into this exact underground bunker. But Thorne's delusion shattered almost immediately. He had genuinely expected Sarah to eventually accept him, to understand somehow that he had saved her from an ordinary life. Instead, she fought him with a furious, unbreakable rage. She spat in his face. She screamed until her voice tore itself apart. She told him, again and again, that she would rather die than spend one more second looking at him. Thorne realized in that bunker that he could never break her, that whatever bound her Mark ran far deeper than anything he could ever force or fake. And so, that very same night, in the freezing dark of that concrete room, Elias Thorne murdered them both. Captain Miller had to stop reading for a moment, the weight of the room pressing down on him like something physical. The 3 officers behind him stood in stunned, horrified silence. The sheer, calculated evil of it was almost impossible to fully absorb. But the journal wasn't finished. And its most chilling chapter wasn't the murder itself. It was a masterpiece of deception Thorne built the very next morning. He knew that once police realized the couple was missing, the entire county would be searching, and he needed absolute certainty that no officer would ever set foot on his property. He needed a decoy. He needed to build a ghost story convincing enough to survive decades of scrutiny. Before sunrise that Saturday, he drove back to the highway, used heavy chains to haul the rec station wagon out of the ditch, and drove it clear across the mountain range to the remote logging road near Whisper Basin. He parked it there deliberately. He left Sarah's purse on the floorboard on purpose. He placed the topographical map on the dashboard as a prop, never once realizing that Mark's frantic handwriting had scarred straight through the paper beneath it. To Thorne, it was simply set dressing, a way to make the scene look like two people who had gotten hopelessly lost. Then he pushed down the manual locks, shut the door, left the keys behind on the seat, and stepped out into the mud in his heavy, custom-laced hunting boots. He walked in a perfectly straight, deliberate line toward the tree line, making absolutely sure his boots left deep, unmistakable tracks in the soft earth. He marched 2 full miles to the edge of the fast-moving river, waded directly into the freezing current, and let it carry him downstream, washing his scent completely away. He climbed out onto a bed of solid rock where no footprint could survive, and hiked quietly back to his own truck, leaving behind an impossible locked-room mystery in the middle of the wilderness, a puzzle built entirely out of pieces that were never meant to fit. And then, in the ultimate act of arrogant, almost psychopathic control, Elias Thorne walked straight into the Oak Creek Police Precinct and volunteered to help lead the search for the very people he had murdered. He stood shoulder to shoulder with detectives. He drank coffee with Mark's grieving younger brother. He stared at massive search maps, deliberately pointing his thick fingers toward Whisper Basin, quietly steering the K-9 units, the helicopters, the entire weight of a desperate county's resources away from his own 60 acres of land. He watched an entire town tear itself apart with grief, and he hid behind the mask of a helpful, quiet woodsman the whole time. For 31 years he kept Mark's watch, Sarah's ring, and the car keys sitting on that table in his bunker, trophies proving, at least to himself, that he had been smarter than everyone. Captain Miller closed the journal. The silence in that underground room felt absolute. The mystery of the locked car, the single set of tracks, the vanished couple, all of it had just been completely, horrifically solved. He turned to the officers behind him. "Bring the digging equipment," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion but his orders unwavering. "They're here." They never made it to the mountain. The final pages of the journal contained a crude, hand-drawn map of the salvage yard, marking one very specific spot buried deep in the thickest blackberry brush, far from the bunker itself. By 3 a.m, under the glare of portable stadium lights, a forensic excavation team began digging through freezing rain, working with a desperate, solemn reverence that nobody had to ask for. At 4:15 that morning, a shovel struck something wrapped in heavy, rotted canvas. The digging stopped instantly. Forensic anthropologists climbed carefully down into the muddy trench, using small brushes and hand tools to clear away the dirt with painstaking care. And there, buried side by side in the cold earth for over 3 decades, they finally found them. Even in death, something broke the heart of every hardened officer standing at the edge of that grave. Mark's skeletal arm was still wrapped tightly around Sarah's shoulders. He had been holding her. He had protected her, in whatever way he still could, all the way to the very end. The sun was just beginning to rise over Oak Creek, painting the wet gray clouds in faint streaks of purple and gold. When Captain Miller finally left the property, his uniform soaked through with mud and rain, utterly exhausted, he drove back to the precinct in total silence. And when he stepped through his office door, David and retired Detective Thomas Harris were still there, sitting exactly where he'd left them, neither one having slept a single minute. They looked up as the door opened. Miller unbuckled his belt, set it slowly on the desk, and looked at David with red, swollen eyes. "We found them, David," he said quietly, his voice cracking down the middle. "We brought them home." For a fraction of a second, the word simply hung in the air, and then 31 years of not knowing. 31 years of staring out windows, of hoping against every shred of evidence, of quietly wondering whether they had simply run away and started a new life somewhere else. All of it shattered at once. David collapsed forward in his chair, burying his face in his hands, and let out a raw, agonized sob that echoed down the quiet hallway of the precinct. It was the sound of a man finally setting down a mountain of grief he had carried on his shoulders for his entire adult life. He cried for his brother. He cried for Sarah. And he cried for his mother, Evelyn, who had died just a few short years too soon to finally learn the truth. Thomas Harris rose slowly and crossed the room, placing a trembling hand on David's back, silent tears sliding down his own weathered cheeks. The guilt that had haunted his entire retirement, the terrible knowledge that he had personally let a murderer direct his own search teams, finally began just slightly to lift. In its place came something more complicated. An overwhelming sadness, yes, but underneath it, something that finally resembled peace. The case was no longer cold, and the failure, at long last, had been answered. News of Elias Thorne's arrest sent shockwaves far beyond Oak Creek. Local television stations broke into their morning broadcast to show footage of the massive police presence at the salvage yard, and within days the story of two missing newlyweds, a hidden bunker, and a search leader who had spent 3 decades hiding in plain sight became national news. Thorne was placed in a high-security isolation cell and refused to speak with detectives. He wouldn't look at the photographs laid out before him. When investigators brought the leather journal into the interrogation room and set it on the metal table between them, he simply stared at the wall, offering nothing. No remorse. No explanation beyond what was already written in his own hand. He was a man who had lived so long inside his own private, twisted reality that he seemed to have genuinely forgotten what it meant to be human. The legal process moved swiftly and without mercy. There was no need for a long, dramatic trial. The evidence was overwhelming and airtight. The plaster cast matched his boots exactly. The restored photograph placed him at the wedding beyond any doubt. The journal contained a detailed, handwritten confession to a double murder, and the remains recovered from his own property provided the final, undeniable forensic proof. 3 months later, Elias Thorne stood before a judge in a packed, utterly silent courtroom. David sat in the front row, staring holes into the back of the man's skull. The judge didn't hesitate. Thorne was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison, without any possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as the sentence was read aloud. He was let out in heavy steel chains, head bowed, and he would die alone in a concrete cell just 4 years later, forgotten at last by the very world he had spent 31 years quietly manipulating. But the story of Oak Creek didn't end in that courtroom. It ended, instead, on a warm, bright afternoon the following spring. For the first time in 31 years, the entire town gathered together for Mark and Sarah. Hundreds of people filled the same small church where they had been married so many decades earlier. Former students from Sarah's second-grade classroom, now grown adults with children of their own, came to pay their respects. Old co-workers from the shipping firm stood quietly in the back rows. Captain Miller and retired Detective Thomas Harris stood near the doors in their dress uniforms, watching in silence as the community finally found a way to heal. David stood at the wooden podium at the front of the church, older now, gray threading through his hair at the temples, but his voice steady and unshaken. He didn't talk about the monster who had taken them, or the freezing rain, or the dark woods, or the bunker buried in the earth. He talked instead about a quiet accountant who had loved his wife so fiercely that he threw his own unarmed body between her and a loaded rifle. He talked about a bright, fearless young teacher who refused to be broken, who fought a much larger man to her very last breath rather than surrender an inch of who she was. He talked about their laughter, their kindness, the beautiful, unremarkable, deeply ordinary life they had built together in the short time they were given. After the service, the crowd moved slowly up to the quiet cemetery overlooking the town, where 2 polished wooden caskets were finally lowered into the earth, side by side, directly beside the grave of Evelyn, Sarah's mother, who had waited her entire life for an answer she never got to hear. The family was at long last together again. David stayed by the grave long after everyone else had gone, the warm spring sun filtering gently through the leaves of the old oak trees overhead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out that same small yellow envelope from the 1-hour photo lab, sliding the strip of dark negatives out of the protective sleeve, holding them up once more to the light. For 31 years, The truth had been sitting there the whole time, trapped in a few microscopic frames of chemical emulsion, buried inside a dusty attic, patiently waiting for someone to finally hold it up to the sun. It proved that evil can hide behind the most helpful, familiar smile, that a monster can walk right beside you in broad daylight, drinking your coffee, pointing calmly at a map, and you will never see it coming. But it proved something else too, something far more powerful, that the truth does not stay buried forever. The earth gives up its secrets eventually. A single footprint, an indentation pressed into old paper, a dark shadow lingering in the corner of a forgotten photograph. These things wait quietly in the dark, refusing to be erased, until someone somewhere is finally brave enough to look closely. David smiled softly, tears welling in his eyes, and gently laid the envelope of negatives down on the cold stone of the grave marker. He turned up the collar of his jacket against the breeze, pushed his hands deep into his pockets, and walked slowly down the hill toward his car. Behind him, the wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the faint, sweet scent of autumn pine across the hillside. The missing posters were long gone. The search, after 31 impossible years, was